Right. Go.
Hello, everybody out there. This is George Gruhn, Gruhn Guitars, Nashville, Tennessee. Today is July 15, 2022, the Ides of July. Hot weather out here in Nashville. We've had some rain in the past week, unlike places in the West that sure enough need it. But it's hot as blazes out there and humid. Got a number of things we can discuss today. Got some questions, but we can certainly use more. So by all means, if you've got questions, send them on in and I will plow into them. We've been busy folks this week. This is the week of the Chet Atkins Appreciation Society annual get-together in Nashville. About 400 of them. Some really good players like Guy Van Duzer, Muriel Anderson, Tommy Emmanuel, and a host of others, as well as lots of folks who come to the Music City Sheraton near the airport, listen to concerts, jam, see exhibits. Mayton's exhibiting, Gretsch is exhibiting, a few others. But anyway, it's an interesting get-together, and we're only about 15 minutes away from that venue, so lots of them come over to see us. We have a few fun instruments that just came in that I'll show before getting into the questions coming in from our listeners. One just delivered less than an hour ago, personally hand delivered, Paul Newson, brand new F5 style mandolin. It's pretty. And aside from being pretty, with Michigan maple, red spruce, completely handmade, one-man shop, it is a great sounding instrument, very much on par with some extremely fine vintage ones, but for a whole lot less than buying some of the old collectibles. This instrument new, $9,500. And I can say that although it's brand new with zero break-in time, just got strung up, it's an amazingly good instrument. A truly superb mandolin. Another instrument that we just took in, a fun piece, 1986, Wayne Henderson 00042 12-fret guitar, Brazilian rosewood back and sides, and a very fine instrument, highly collectible. And another that just came in will be on our website tonight. This is a 1965 Fender Stratocaster, early enough in the year that it has an L series serial number on the plate rather than the Fender F logo. Still has the small peg head, Olympic white finish. There's some normal lacquer checking, but otherwise, on the body at least, not on the neck, but it looks almost new. It still has the original case, original hang tags. It's in absolutely amazing condition. It's early enough to have the clay dot markers on the fingerboard. So it basically looks exactly like a 1964 model, but it is early 65 and serial number L64 and 3 more digits. But the point is, this is a superlative example that we rarely see one this clean. And it is, of course, a rare color and a really great find. So something that we are proud to have. Now, plowing into comments and questions from listeners. We have one from James McDaniel. He's Director of Sound and Vibration Laboratory, faculty in residence at Boston University Department of Mechanical Engineering. And he has written in that there was a 1933 Cadillac car owned by Al Jolson that he thought was an amazing enough vehicle in squeaky clean condition, and that made him think about the 1933 12-fret slot head D28 that I got. The car new was $8,000, which was hugely expensive for any American car in 1933. You could buy multiple Ford automobiles for like a Style A. You could get those for way less. But this was Al Jolson's Cadillac, special custom order, but $8,000. And that got me to thinking that if you'd spent $8,000 in 1933 on Martin guitars, or you couldn't have gotten, it would have been the D28 that I have new cost $100. That'd be enough to buy 80 of the $8,000 cost of the car would be the cost of 80 D28s, but they didn't make 80 D28s in 1933. They only made 12. They certainly did, however, make more than 80 guitars. And during the 30s, they made, sure enough, more than 80 D28s. They just weren't all in 33. But if you just get out the handy dandy calculator, you'd see that $100 divided into 8,000, that's 80. And if you look at even D28s, or of course you could have bought D45s and other things as well, but the price of a squeaky clean 34 through 37, if you got it just regular finish, that would bring for a squeaky clean one as much as 200. And so if you pick, today, though, like I said, what was 8,000 then would be 200,000 each. So 200,000. see, 200,000 times 80, and there's $16,000. But if you bought D45s, and back then, if you had $88,000, excuse me, if you ordered them from Martin, you probably could have gotten a discount. But even if you paid full price at $200 each, you know, again, $8,000. That would give you, 40 of them, $200, 8,000 divided by 200, there's 40 of them. But today, D45s in squeaky clean condition are bringing 400,000 plus. So if you multiply 400,000 times, you're going to get still the $16 million, but some of those D45s might bring more. The point is, this money invested in Martin guitars would bring way more than the cost that you could get. The price you could get at auction for Al Jolson's car would not be 16 million plus. And musical instruments have been a great investment. There's plenty of examples that in 1970, clean 1950s slab board Stratocasters were ringing around $400. And today, some of those same guitars can be $40,000 plus. And Sunburst Les Pauls in 1970 were bringing about $1,000 to $1,200. And today, those instruments bring 300,000, or some with beautifully figured tops will push 500,000. They may not be going up at that same rate of appreciation right now, but they're not falling. Many guitar prices did indeed take a hit during the recession of 2008, but for the most part, flat top acoustics and rock and roll type guitars have fully made up whatever they lost and are still going up. And those that did take a hit and went down to some extent are indeed regaining ground now. So archtop acoustics, less so. Banjos and mandolins, less so, although they're holding their own and creeping back up. But the prices over the past couple of years on flat top guitars and rock and roll guitars are definitely dramatically up. Questions from others. Karsten Haslett has 3 questions. One is, how does oxidation affect old pickups? Well, to some extent, it just depends how bad it is and what's causing that oxidation. For example, if you have a guitar with outgassing acidic fumes from a deteriorating pick guard or pickup covers or bindings, that can corrode magnets. It can damage the pickup windings. Also, just age in general on some pickups, components just are not as tight anymore, and pickups can become microphonic to the point where they're difficult to use on stage. But oxidation such that it damages the coil windings will require rewinding a pickup. And if they're stored under proper conditions of temperature and humidity and kept away from deteriorating plastic, these pickups can last an extremely long time. Another thing that can happen with older pickups is the magnets can get weak, and it's important to realize that that is less of a problem than one might think. There are remagnetizing machines that can easily put the magnets back to correct strength. So pickups can be demagnetized or remagnetized, and that is a controllable operation. If you have the right equipment, it is easy to do. He has another question regarding repairs. Fender necks can warp. An example is a bowed bass peg head. Can they be repaired or straightened out? Are they likely to be stable if this is done? And are slab board necks more likely to bow? Overall, I would say the slab board necks are not more likely to bow, but they are more easy to work on. The slab board necks have fingerboards that are quite thick, so it is possible to take them down a bit so far as you can plane them before refretting. You can plane out some dings and still have plenty of fingerboard left to work with, or fingernail wear in the board. You can plane out. You can't do nearly as much of that on a maple neck without making a mess of it if there's no fingerboard. It's also, if you're heat setting a neck that has a bit of a bow on a slab board neck, if you can get it where the glue is coming loose and you can re-glue the board, you can get it where it will be much more stable and holding after you do the work. Whereas on a maple neck, it just has the skunk stripe on the back, but no actual fingerboard, a heat set may not hold. It's more likely to warp. A problem on necks also is that occasionally a neck will even have a sideways bow warp. And that's something that we have not had much luck working on, but fortunately we very rarely see that. But we have actually seen necks where instead of just bowing this way, it actually will warp this way so that the strings can, in the middle E string can miss the fingerboard. And we've not had much luck fixing that. Some basses particularly have a lot of pressure, and occasionally we've seen where the peg head was cut a bit thin and the peg head itself can warp. In other words, the neck from the nut on down is normal specs, but the peg head itself is warped pulling forward. And generally when that happens, it's very difficult to stabilize it. And so that can be problematic. I've seen also some of the necks like Jackson style that Jackson and a number of others did necks where the peg head, those pointy peg heads, instead of pointing straight up, where they have a peg head going off that direction, where it was built that way, and they have string guides to hold it, but that puts a lot of sideways and upward pressure on the peg head. And I have seen a number of those. I remember very well when I was working with Guild in the mid-1980s, that they had some that had peg heads of that design on the pilot bass, and the bass peg heads would warp severely. And that was not something easily fixed short of a new neck. Further has one other question. Same person. What is your opinion of the Ren Ferguson period Gibson acoustics, specifically the reissue Advanced Jumbo? What is your favorite era of J200s? Well, I certainly like the pre-World War II Rosewood J200s of 37 through 42. They bring a lot more money than the post-war ones, but of the post-war ones, the ones from at 46 on through the 50s vary considerably in quality. They're somewhat inconsistent on quality of sound, but when you get a good one, they're plenty good. And I do like them if you get the right one, but they're not as uniform as I might like to see. Some of them are a bit dead sounding, whereas others are vibrantly alive and really good. And but the good ones do tend to be from late 1940s, actually just shortly after World War II, through the 50s and on in as late as 1960. But after that, when they have the adjustable saddle overall, those do not appeal to me nearly as much. There are people who like them because they still look neat. And if you're just slapping rhythm chords, they can be fine. But for lead and blues playing, I feel that the earlier ones with the non-adjustable saddles are by far the best ones. And just the workmanship overall back then was different. Those are the ones that also have a two-piece maple neck with a dark center-lined laminate that you can see from the back. The later ones had three-piece necks with two narrow dark laminations, and those are not only later, but they're structurally different animals, and they really don't play and sound the same. But so far as Ren Ferguson era instruments, and specifically the Advanced Jumbo reissue, the Advanced Jumbo reissue was indeed a good guitar, although frankly, the reissue doesn't sound much like the pre-war model. The pre-World War II Advanced Jumbos from the 30s are amazingly good guitars, and in my opinion are the best sounding Gibson flat top guitars ever made. And I most assuredly do think very highly of them. But when Ren Ferguson was very much involved with the production of new Gibsons in Bozeman, quality improved very significantly over what it had been under the previous administration. But in my opinion, a lot of what he did was just getting back to reasonably consistent bracing patterns similar to old, but he didn't come up with much that was really innovatively unlike anything that Gibson had ever done before. He just improved the quality over the previous administration. What he did that was new was ornamentation, and he was a great inlay artist. And just the ornamentation of some of the custom instruments that came out during his tenure, especially the ones that he did personally, were quite remarkable. And they were some of the most beautifully ornamented Gibson acoustics that had ever been made. So they are something quite special. We have from Rich Words, says, I just purchased a Martin Style 5 bowlback mandolin from a luthier in Minnesota. Serial number on the end block, or it'd be actually on the neck block, is 1401. Martin mandolins have a different serial number sequence than their guitars. The Martin guitar serial number list will not guide you for dating their mandolins. He says it appears to be in beautiful condition, holds tune relatively well with decent action. Judging from the serial number on the Martin serial number list, it would appear to have been made in 1904, and he was using the correct mandolin list. There's a handwritten label on the underside of the soundboard. He had a picture attached. Does this appear to be similar to other labels you've seen? And do you think it was actually written by Frank Henry Martin? Well, it is autographed FHM, which is typical of what Frank Henry Martin did on those mandolins. And that label does indeed appear to be authentic and original. Says it has nice tone, quite different from my F model maple mandolin. Of course, this is different because this is a bowlback mandolin with rosewood back and bowl. So he says rosewood bowlback is beautiful, and the inlays on the top and fretboard positions are very ornate, which the Style 5 had very fancy ornamentation. So it is possible to look up further information. In this case, Martin kept absolutely meticulous records going all the way back into the 1830s, although unfortunately the 1840s ledger book disappeared many years ago and no one seems to have been able to locate it. But even from the 1840s, there's a lot of correspondence that was still saved. They just didn't throw their paperwork away. They saved correspondence, they saved factory foreman ledgers. They just had unbelievably meticulous records, although it's only in much more recent years that all of this has been microfilmed and then cataloged and cross-indexed so that they, at least at the factory, can access a good bit of this information. Also, one person who was permitted in for many years, Greg Hutton, copied these ledgers, photographed them, and spent years putting this information together in computer cross-indexed files so that we were able to contact him. And his reply was as follows. Serial number 1401 is a 1904 Style 5 mandolin. It was stamped on April 30, 1904, and was shipped to the Bartlett Music Company in Los Angeles on July 28, 1904. The sales record notes it was made with dull finish, so a matte finish rather than high gloss. This mandolin appeared on eBay in December 2014. So Hutton's done record keeping that he keeps track of things that even the Martin factory hasn't done. The signature under the top is certainly typical of the time. FHM is, of course, Frank Henry Martin. FHM signed most instrument tops between 1898 and 1916. Martin made 277 Style 5 mandolins between 1897 and 1920. After 1920, Martin phased out bowlback mandolins and went to flatback mandolins. And a bit later in the 20s, they introduced carved top and back mandolins. But still, mandolins were never as big a component of Martin's production as they had been for Gibson. Gibson started out with Orville Gibson hand building instruments in the 1890s. He sold his patent to a group of Kalamazoo, Michigan investors in 1902, led by Lewis Williams. And they named the company the Gibson Mandolin-Guitar Company. And that mandolins, was their big item. Prior to 1920, they actually made more mandolins than they did guitars. But starting in 1918, they introduced banjos into the line, and then they continued to develop those where designs evolved through the 20s and into the 30s. But And Gibson mandolins are highly sought after today, especially the F5 model. But the style 5 bowlback Martin mandolin, certainly a museum-worthy instrument, beautifully ornamented. It would be extremely expensive to reproduce such an instrument today with the same level of ornamentation and materials. It would be very expensive. On the other hand, there are very few people today in the USA or elsewhere playing bowlback mandolins. So the marketability is currently very significantly less than it would cost to build one today. So price when new is not necessarily a function of how much they're going to bring today. There are some items that were extremely expensive new, such as fancy accordions built in the 1920s, don't have much appeal today and often bring less money today than they cost brand new in the 20s. But then there are other things like an RB3 Gibson flathead one-piece flange master tone banjo made in the 30s, original 5-string, could bring well over $100,000, but only when new was $100. And even the RB75 that was only $75 new in a master tone from the later 30s could still bring over $100,000 if it's one-piece flange and flathead. But an all-American Gibson banjo that was $550 for a raised head tenor today would be more in the range of $35,000. But the demand for tenor banjos is not great. So how much they cost new is not simply multiplied by some factor and you get what they're going to bring today. Some things that were expensive new didn't go up nearly as much in value as some other items that cost less than half as much. You'd have to invest in the right stuff, and sometimes we didn't happen to be clairvoyant then, and we're not clairvoyant now. Back then, people might have thought that 5-string banjos were never going to take off for people who had money and that Dixieland would continue. So they'd probably have put their money into tenor and plectrum banjos if they were going to invest in banjos, or they might have gone for the most expensive model. And sometimes the most expensive model didn't go up in value near as much as some models that cost less when new. Even for Fender guitars, a Fender Jaguar was the most expensive guitar in the Fender catalog during the 60s, but the same amount of money put into Telecasters or Stratocasters during the same years would bring a lot more money now than if it had all been put into Jazzmasters and Jaguars. We have some other questions. Peter Ward says, I have a 1939 Gibson ES-150 of the kind played by Charlie Christian. There's a small hole near the output jack where there may have been a strap button. Did the ES-150 have a strap button? If I have a replacement button installed, it appears there's nothing to anchor the screw on the inside of the guitar, on the other side of the hole. What do you think? The ES-150 had an output jack that was located in the right where an end pin would go, but it wasn't an end pin. And most of the people who played those played sitting down. There are ways to put a strap button attached onto that fixture at the end. And what I can tell you is that it's possible to build a system that will be non-invasive on the guitar and still get the job done so far as having a place to tie a strap. but Gibson wasn't thinking much that jazz players were going to be playing those things standing up back then when those were first made. Cornel Dreisen, what is your opinion about the 2019 Martin 0028 Clapton model in comparison with the 0028 standard? Are the top woods different or not? I like the vintage yellow. Well, they are made with Sitka spruce. The top wood is not different, but the Clapton model does have different neck dimensions, slightly different ornamentation. It is built to the specs that Clapton liked as far as feel. Both are good, but the 0028 standard was not herringbone trimmed in 2019, whereas the Clapton model was. So the Clapton model overall is a more deluxe instrument, and they have been good guitars. Martin continues to make them out of all the models that were artist endorsed that Martin has ever done. The Clapton 000 guitars, of which there are a number of different versions, have outsold all other artist endorsement models Martin ever made that were made with an artist's name affiliated with the model. I don't believe that Clapton took any royalty payments personally, but rather had that money donated to charities of his choice, so far as any royalties on them, which was a noble thing to do. I've done business with Eric since 1970, and I can say from direct personal experience that I found Eric to be a very pleasant person to talk to do business with, aside from being an incredibly fine musician. Lenny Samzik wants an opinion on the new Gibson Generation collection with 2 sound holes, one on the upper bout of the body. Having a sound port on the upper bout directs sound where the player can more easily hear what's going on as he is playing. And that's something typically not so much needed at home playing, but if you're on stage, if you don't have those built-in earphones or stage monitors, having the sound port can make it easier to hear what's going on. But for good quality acoustics, I don't have any trouble hearing myself when I'm playing, and I don't typically play guitars with sound ports. But the new Gibson acoustics are quite good. And they've made some very considerable strides. They also more than doubled the size of their Bozeman, Montana factory. So they're making more guitars. They're ramping up production, and they're putting considerable effort into quality control. So I don't have anything at all bad to say about them. It's going to be a matter of personal opinion as to what you like. But when it comes down to it, the new Gibson flat top guitars are vastly superior to what the company made 50 years ago. The ones made when I first opened my store in January of '70 were absolutely horrific. They were nowhere near as good as what Gibson had made during the 1960s and earlier. when Norland took over, management changed, quality standards changed, and they cheapened the product. But that is not the case today. Norland sold to Henry Juskowitz and his partners in early '86, and more recently, the new management took over after Henry Juskowitz was ousted. New management has been very vigorous in defending their design trademarks. There have been legal cases still pending on that, but the quality has definitely been on the uptake. That the new management has been paying attention to quality control and to promotion. So I would certainly say that it's well worth the effort to take a look at some of what they're doing these days. Larry Harris asks, what are your thoughts on Furch guitars, F-U-R-C-H? Those are made in the Czech Republic. They are factory made, but good quality. They also do some subcontracting for a variety of other distributors. And I have had a few of them go through my shop, and they were good quality. Do I believe they're better than old Martins? No, but they're stage-worthy, professional-grade instruments, and certainly in their price bracket, they are competitive. Mark Radke asks, what string gauges do you recommend for Stratocasters and Les Pauls? And the answer is, I don't recommend any. That doesn't mean you shouldn't have strings on them. It means that I'm not personally really an electric guitar player, but what I do see is that very good players differ in what type gauge they use. And it depends so much on the style music you play and what sort of sound you are striving to get. When they were new, these guitars back in the 50s came with heavy flat wound strings with a wound third, and people were not playing with extensive string bending. Today, Billy Gibbons uses extremely light strings, 7-gauge high E. And I couldn't even play chords on that. You play a note, it's going to start sliding around. If you have good control over note bending, which he does, and he's not doing lots of full chords, those strings can work great. But if you want to play jazz chords, you're much better off with heavy flat wound strings with a wound third. The point is, the sound you get on a Strat or a Tele or a Les Paul is certainly impacted not only by your personal playing technique, but by what gauge strings you use. And there's no right or wrong answer for that question. The right gauge string is the gauge that you find comfortable for your style of playing and that sounds good for your style of playing. And when everybody plays exactly the same style and has exactly the same touch, then we'll only need one string gauge. But until then, that's not happening. We need to use what suits the music and the instrument. Some instruments respond better to medium gauge strings than they do to lights, and vice versa. but so much of it is personal preference and then what style music you are playing. And some styles, such as jazz, pretty well demand that you use a much heavier string than you'd use for R&B or heavy metal. So again, there's no right or wrong answer. Lenny Samsic asks for an opinion on Wector guitars, double Florentine cutaway. I don't have enough information on that. I first met Wector in the very early 1970s, and he was doing some prototype building for Gibson. He's a skilled luthier. Some of his more recent instruments a few years ago were made in China, and he was actually living in China and supervising their production. So Wector brand can be anything from handmade by him personally to made in China. And but I'm actually not quite certain what he's up to at this particular instant in time. But I do know that certainly even as far as 10 or 15 years ago, the instruments he was doing were Asian, but they were good quality Asian because he was personally supervising it. He was not someone to put his name on junk. So if he didn't personally make it, he still supervised and took pride in what he was doing. So I would expect it to be a good quality instrument. Darren Lewis King says, I am considering a Paul Beard custom build resonator guitar. Can you tell me about Paul Beard's guitars? Paul Beard is located in Hagerstown, Maryland. He's an extremely skilled builder. In my opinion, he builds the best wood body resonator acoustic guitars that I've ever heard. And he also, in addition to doing the woodwork, does the metal work. So he actually bought the tool and die equipment and the stamping and spinning machines that were used to produce dobro cover plates, spider bridges, resonator cones, tailpieces. Gibson had subcontracted those pieces when they owned the dobro company, and they were actually using the same guy who had done them in California when dobro was an independent company. So dobro company goes all the way back to the late 1920s. But Paul Beard doesn't go that far back, but his quality is impeccably good. And he has endorsements from some of the top resonator guitar players, such as Jerry Douglas. I happen to think he's also an upstanding, absolutely wonderful individual. He's a good electric guitar player personally, so you can play not only bluegrass style dobro, but he is an accomplished electric guitar player, and he's able to make electric and acoustic non-resonator guitars. He built my more recent Gruhn design electrics. We subcontracted those to Paul Beard, but he's now so busy on his own design resonator guitars that he's back ordered, doesn't have time to make mine. But I highly recommend his work. And we stock a good selection of Beard resonator guitars here at Gruhn Guitars. They do well for us. Customers who play them tend to be extremely satisfied with them. They are high quality instruments. So I can tell you without hesitation that those are good pieces, well worth having. And if you custom build a guitar, I would expect the quality to be excellent. But in general, my advice about custom building is that when you custom order something, you better be real sure exactly what you want, and also be prepared for the fact that it can be expected to look exactly like the specifications you submitted, but sound may have a subjective segment of consideration, and the exact feel and tone can vary. Even on instruments that are built with seemingly identical specifications, no two pieces of wood respond exactly the same. And there is some human judgment in building these things. You want to get a standard model, standard catalog model, you probably play a dozen and pick out the one you like the best. But when you custom order one and you put money down and they build it as a one-off to your specifications, you better be prepared for the fact that it's going to be your guitar, whether the finished product really pleases you or not. They're not going to make you another one at no extra charge if you don't like the first one, unless they've done something that really screwed up the order. They didn't follow your specs, and they may be willing to sell the one that you had ordered but didn't come out by expectation. But that's rare. Typically, what it gets down to is if it comes in and you don't like it, it's yours. And usually, I find I can look at a dozen instruments of the same make and model and year, and one will speak to me more than the others do. But if I custom order, I don't get that privilege. So I tend, for my own personal stuff, I'll look for instruments that are used or vintage, but I can still go through and pick out the ones that I personally enjoy. John Chamberlain says, hello, George. Could you give us a profile of the guitar collector who is willing to pay top dollar for rare, expensive vintage instruments? Well, I don't know that there is just one profile, but in general, there are certain attributes he's going to have. One, he's going to have dollars or other currency that can be converted to dollars, and lots of it, because collecting for the really expensive vintage instruments, by definition, expensive isn't cheap. So he's likely to be well educated, highly skilled at something, not necessarily a musician. In fact, most working musicians play utility tools rather than true collectibles. There are exceptions to that. It's people like Joe Bonamassa, who definitely is a collector as well as a player. And Clapton, Vince Gill, I can certainly name some, but most of them who are truly very sophisticated collectors with large quantities of superb instruments that would qualify as a collection, because it's not just a whole bunch of one model, but it's representative selections that show the history and evolution of a particular maker, almost like museum displays. Those people are sophisticated, educated, and have wealth. But so far as age, a high percentage of them are baby boomers. But now, in the internet age, when there are some self-made billionaires in the computer business, website development, etc., they can be millennials who are now close to 40 or a little older. Those people certainly can be collectors. Most of the collectors are men over 40, but anytime you start trying to get a profile of this sort, well, that means you're profiling. And profiling, whether it's politically correct or not, is often not really thoroughly reliable. What we do see, though, is that the typical collectors are usually not professional musicians. They're usually over 40 and typically under 70. But I'll be 77 next month, and I'm still collecting. And I have some customers who are very close to my age, but we don't see a bunch of 18-year-old or 20-year-old or even 30-year-old collectors. That's rare. Usually the collectors are 40 plus in age, male, and typically not a professional musician, but still highly knowledgeable, well-educated, and well-funded. Darren Lewis King, another. I have some Gibsons built in 2017, a Les Paul, an SG, and an Explorer. How is Gibson's quality in 2017? I know there was rumored to be some quality issues at that time. And that is a time when, under Henry Jeskowitz, Gibson was struggling and there were management issues. But what I'd say is that not everything was uniformly bad. And if you have the right ones, they can be very good. And without seeing the guitars in person, I'm not going to make too much of an effort to do judgment on them. So I have at this point one further question that's come in, and then I can just wrap it up after that by telling you that we live in interesting times. There's a lot going on out there, but overall, the guitar market is strong. And not only is the guitar market strong, but there are some encouraging signs. For example, inflation was getting really bad. And I'd commented on some previous presentations over the weeks that the cost of shipping a 20-foot container from China to the US had gone from about $4,000 to closer to $40,000. Well, now it's gone back down and it's more like $8,000. And the cost differential between a 20-foot container and a 40-foot container in shipping costs is not that much. And gasoline prices also in the past few weeks have started to go back down. And that's in spite of all the turmoil in the Middle East and Russia. So demand for guitars is good. And even if Chicken Little thinks that the sky is falling, it might not be yet. But does that mean everything is wonderful yet? Probably no. There's one last question I had. John Kaltenecker asks, why is the acoustic guitar bridge orientation different on Martin and Gibson guitars? Are there any measurable acoustic or structural differences? Well, darn near everything on a Martin and a Gibson is different. Even when the body shapes are pretty similar, the workmanship is not the same. The bracing patterns are similar, but not identical. The neck shapes are different. Their setup work, their neck angles, their peg head angles, they're just simply not the same. Gibson typically has a somewhat thicker saddle on the bridge than Martin, and this can give them a bit more room to play around with string intonation, where they can file or bevel edges more than with Martin. And that in itself is enough to cause them to set the saddle slant a bit different. But both Martin and Gibson seem at this point to be coming up with acoustic guitars that intonate better than any in their previous company history. So whether we can debate how good Martin and Gibson acoustics are compared to the golden era period of acoustics from the 1920s and 30s, the fact is, so far as physical ease of playing and intonation, but particularly intonation, they've never been better. So Martin and Gibson both may be doing slightly different tweaks to get the result, but both are getting the result of remarkably good intonation compared to many vintage instruments. That's a wrap for today. I'll look forward to hearing and seeing you next week. And Titus seems to be a little hyper about it, but he's saying bye-bye too. Titus is a very good custodian of our floor here. This floor of the building is his personal palace in which I'm the butler that tends to his needs. And he is here to greet all the visitors who are here to pay homage to him in his palace every week. Till next week, have a good one.